Hello and welcome to another episode of The Agenda by the Indian Youth Economic Association. Today, we're not just completing 13 years of the IYEA, but our topic for discussion is also an anniversary in a sense, not as celebratory, of course. We will be discussing 50 years of the emergency. And for that, we have with us Professor Srinath Raghavan, whose latest book is Indira Gandhi in the Years That Transformed India. And that will be the core part of our discussion today. Very warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Again, Professor Raghavan is not someone who needs an introduction, but he is undoubtedly one of the foremost historians in the country. Right? I have my own bias because he was my undergraduate thesis mentor, and a good chunk of my interest in history comes from brilliant discussions that we had with him over the years. But Professor Raghavan has had a background not just in the hard sciences, but after that went on to serve in the Indian Armed Forces. He's also the official historian for the 1999 Kargil War, and has written extensively on issues relating to Indian security, international relations, specifically focused towards South Asia. Right. Two of the books, the one that we'll be discussing today is right here. That's on Indira Gandhi and how she transformed the nation. India's War is another interesting book on India's role during the Second World War, right? And it also deals with the domestic Indian political considerations back in the day. The one before that is one before Indira Gandhi, was the one pertaining to the most dangerous place on earth, that had to do with the Indian relations with America and American relations within South Asia. And the 1971, or the global history of the 71 war, was the one before that. Professor Raghavan has extensively edited commentaries on papers. And again, because we have a limited duration and all of this is readily available, it will be readily available on our bio for this video. So one can definitely look all of that up. A link to the book, the Amazon link to the latest book, will also be up on our bio, so you can definitely pick it up from there. Sorry, Professor Raghavan, I didn't sort of go on the exact details on almost everything. And
No.
I thought whatever I said, I did say from memory. I hope I did not skip on the important bits there. Professor Raghavan, so we'll begin and we'll cut to the chase. Absolutely, it reads like a thriller. I don't know if that's a compliment or it's to be taken as a compliment by a historian, especially one of your stature, right? Because very often we say, okay, if people are yawning, is the threshold as to how great an academic treatise is. But I personally thought that it read an absolute thriller, and there are certain themes that we will be discussing that I thought were the primary focus, or at least my takeaways. Right, and the first part about that is, and that's what I want to discuss first, is Mrs. Indira Gandhi's tendency to personalize the problems. Right, so there is a trend that we witness, and you mentioned this as well, that there are times where a policy was being attacked, or the government was being attacked, right, or a particular decision was being challenged by those either in the opposition or elsewhere, and which she took it as a personal attack on herself, that people were out to get her. Now, as much as that is a nature of people being in high positions of power, how did that play out? And this tendency of everyone is attacking me, how did that impact Mrs. Gandhi's role, not just as prime minister, but even in her interactions with people in the party or elsewhere?
No, Ajay, that's a good point, and it's, I think, one of the threads that runs through the book. In a sense that if you want to, the book is about Indira Gandhi, but it's also about the broader period in which she was, she was the commanding sort of person in Indian political affairs. But I think this aspect of her personality is definitely something that struck me, partly because you see it reflected in various times in which and when I say reflected, even for us as there are documents and letters and other things which actually show up those kinds of anxieties, of course. But I'd say that it needs to be understood in the context of two things, and then we can go through how we think about this particular anxiety, right? The first thing is that see, Indira Gandhi had a lot of experience of politics, but not in a direct kind of a way, right? I mean, she was born into a very prominent nationalist political family. From the time that her father became prime minister, she was more or less, she lived with him in Teen Murti Bhavan. and she was his official hostess. She used to manage his residence, she used to accompany him on travels. And Jawaharlal Nehru was prime minister for 17 years, right? So she's kind of done all of that stuff. She also used to manage the election campaign of her father, her husband, in the 51, the second general elections, and so on. And then in the late 1950s, her father's colleagues persuaded her to become president of the Congress Party, which was actually, in the scheme of things of the Congress Party, a very important role. I mean, Jawaharlal Nehru himself had become, president of the party at a young age, but she was relatively someone who was not that experienced in the electoral or official politics of the time, right? And then but she was still given that opportunity. So she's not a novice to politics, but she always knew that she did not have a particularly strong footing in the party other than being seen as the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, right? That was both her strength, but it was also something that she found was a constraint on her. So from the time that, when Jawaharlal Nehru dies in 1964, the usual kind of Congress party circuits work it up and tell her that, listen, you should come forward. You are his heir and daughter and other things. And at that time, she says, it's ridiculous. I mean, I have other things to worry about and so on. But in 1966, when Lal Bahadur Shastri dies, that opportunity presents itself. And by that time, she's actually quite ready because she has been Minister of Information and Broadcasting in the Shastri cabinet. It is a junior ministry, but she was number 4 in the cabinet. And again, she saw herself as a guardian of the Nehruvian flame, etc. And so she was actually quite keen when the second opportunity presents itself. But she also knows that her path to power is smoothed by a range of, grandees within the Congress party, including Kamaraj, who was the president of the party, but other, regional leaders. And she was also astute enough to know that the reason that they wanted her was because they did not want the main contender for the job, who was Morarji Desai. Right, Morarji Bhai was seen as a more tough and inflexible kind of a politician, and the syndicate wanted someone who they felt was more open to their suggestions and could be pliable and so on. Right, so she knew in a sense that structurally that was the way in which she came into the party. So there is always a degree of insecurity, right? I mean, about who is doing what to you, and the subsequent sort of dip in the Congress party's fortunes, which is where my book really begins, which is the 1967 elections, brings to the fore all of this kind of political pressures and fissures. And, she is inexperienced and also thinks that she's quite vulnerable to the machinations of the party bosses at various levels. So there is that kind of a thread of insecurity which runs, right? And then once she, decides that she wants to break the Congress party in 1969, form her own party, she emerges as much stronger. But the problem then is that she doesn't have too many experienced players on whom to rely, or a party machinery of the old kind to work with. So then again, she feels that, who do I trust? And that's when you see that there is an increasing turn towards her own family, right? Initially, Sanjay Gandhi, and subsequently after Sanjay Gandhi's death, it is Rajiv Gandhi who's kind of bought it. And at various points in this journey, whether it is in ahead of the 1967 elections, when she thinks that the Congress party is kind of, they are going to not do so well, or in the period of the mid 1970s when there were popular movements against Congress governments, first in Gujarat, then in Bihar, which then morphed into a sort of a countrywide movement led by Jayaprakash Narayan called the Navnirman. She felt that everything was targeted against her, right? And the reason she felt was because in some ways she was the most dominant figure. She had reduced the Congress party itself to a cipher. And so in a very real sense, even if it's something against Congress as a political force, it invariably ends up becoming against Indira Gandhi because she has herself structurally created the situation in the same way. Yeah. Which is why when, the Allahabad High Court judgment on 12th June 1975 comes in, which voids her election to Parliament, and then the Supreme Court allows her a conditional stay to appeal, conditional stay of the judgment, and says that, before the final verdict comes out, she can continue as Prime Minister, but not as Member of Parliament. It's a kind of, Justice Krishna Iyer has this kind of, weird order that he passes at that point of time. And and the subsequent demand is for her resignation, which she, of course, thinks that is targeted against her, right? Now, again, Ajay, one of the things I was always reminded when I did this book is that, there are many points at which Indira Gandhi seems paranoid. But Henry Kissinger, who was one of her opponents she never liked and he didn't like her either. Henry Kissinger once said that, and it's an important thing, that even the paranoid can have real enemies, right? Yes, so just because she's paranoid doesn't mean that people are not opposed to her. So let's not confuse her insecurities with the objective political situations that she faced as well. Some of which were of her doing. Certainly at the moment of June, just ahead of the emergency, it was very clear that the demand was, or attempt was, to get her out of office. personally, right? But you see this again when she comes back in 1980. When the opposition, for instance, is challenging her on the way that she's dealing with the situation in Punjab, she actually feels that it's actually the opposition which is ganging up against me. These were the same people who talked of Gandhian values ahead of the emergency, etc., etc. So in a real sense, this is a running thread. But I think part of the problem was that she identified herself so much with not just the party but with the country, that anything, right? And again, there is a second order dimension to this, which I mentioned in the book as well, that the insecurity is always sort of coupled with the concern that some outside forces are working to sort of destabilize her, right? Whether it is Americans or even the Russians at some point of time, right? She always feels that not only are attacks against her as an individual, but that there are outside forces which are orchestrating those attacks. So, and all of this is because she just feels that, well before her sycophants said that, Indira is India, I think she identified herself and her personal interests with the interests of the country in such a close way that, in some ways this was bound to be a running thread through her life. Really.
And I think that gets me to another interesting theme. It's closely related. So you write that insecurity was then combined with an instinct for power, right? And obviously, because she's stayed for a while, she's decided to break up the party. She's got her people on board at the places, right? The presidential election happens, the clash happens. And in that sense, I think the theme that emerges, and you talk about that extensively, is that of the Caesarist politics. Right? On one hand, you had the syndicate, or the old party bosses of the Indian National Congress back in the day, and then that transformation or that transition from that period to this Caesarist system where Mrs. Gandhi projects herself to the people that, all right, this is the large figure, and that's how first she does that to the party, then to the government, and then, I mean, the idea is to break it down, that same image, to the rest of the country. Right. So that theme is very interesting. That Caesarist idea, she crafts that image definitely, but then that's also a necessity to break down the old party bosses who think that the Gungi Godia is someone that they'll be able to control.
No, absolutely. And I think it's useful for us to remember that, power and insecurity can go together. We tend to think of them as somewhat opposites, right? I mean, especially in the context of international relations discussion, you think that, oh, you're insecure because you don't have enough power. Actually, that doesn't have to be there. Even the very powerful can be highly insecure. And in fact, that combination is quite a deadly one because of their insecurity, then they sort of overreact and they have the power to react, right? And which can then lead to all kinds of, damage and destruction. I mean, for instance, in the context of international history, you could think that a country like Germany, ahead of the First World War, is a very good example of both insecurity and power, right, in the context of Europe. So
Yes.
again, so in politics, these things are not opposites. They actually can combine together in a certain situation and a certain personality, right? And Mrs. Gandhi kind of wielded, especially after a tentative start, once she understood that, the only way to kind of, take control of the situation in some ways is to bring all these party bosses to the heel, get the party, cut it down to size, and make it more manageable for her. After that time, she demonstrated an instinct for power, which I think took many people, even those who knew her very well, by surprise. And she had a, and then she used to tell people quite openly, saying that, I don't mind being known as ruthless, right? Also, remember that, she's a woman in a highly gendered and political arena. It's there was always that thing, right, that she had to appear to be much more tougher than. In fact, she writes in personal letters to friends that, I'm actually not someone who's authoritarian in the way that my opponents describe me. But it's just that, I am cold and somewhat aloof, and they tend to sort of think that I'm very, conscious of my power and position and so on. So it's a certain mix of her personality traits, the objective sort of situation in which she found herself, and so on. But the Caesarist kind of transition, and as you said, Caesarism refers to a certain mode of doing politics, which tries to short circuit the institutional channels of the party, parliament, etc., and to try and directly sort of appeal to the people, and then to use popular standing as a way of acclamation. Really, right? I mean, elections are not really about policies or other things. They're simply about the leader and whether the people think that the leader is the best person to lead the country, right? I mean, you just make it a certain kind of a plebiscitarian flavor comes into all of this style of politics. And she adopts that pretty much after she breaks up the Congress party, because once she has broken the party, she doesn't really have a structure which can do the work for her any longer. And the only alternative is to really be able to kind of do this kind of an appeal, which she does with quite a degree of elan. But again, we must remember that there was no certainty that this would have worked out for her. See, the Congress Party actually, got its majority down to 283 in the 1967 election. They lost several states, particularly in North India, important states. But in 1971, when she delinks the state and the national elections and gets the national elections first, she's able to project her image in this way. And that particular, gamble actually works out for her. And, they come back with a thumping majority. And it's a revival of Congress fortunes, which nobody could have anticipated at that point of time. But then, like all Caesarism, there are other things which come into play as well, apart from electoral politics. In 1971 is when the Bangladesh crisis happens. You said that I've written a book about it, and in this book, I'm more focused on what it meant for Indian domestic politics. And what it really meant is that it actually strengthened this kind of Caesarist appeal even more, because here she was seen as this tough leader, who kind of cut Pakistan into half and then took 93,000 prisoners of war, etc., etc. So when you have the state elections, which happened in 1972, the Congress Party actually runs through all the states where they have lost ground previously. And so in a very real sense, everything was not predictable. But her gamble to move towards this kind of model and make it work was a very important political success of hers. And 1972 really is her kind of high point of her political career in some ways. So.
Yeah, but that gets me to another interesting theme, and we were discussing this earlier. I think some portions of where you say, is breaking up the state party bosses, right? So because a syndicate has these leaders from across the country, they are their own bosses in the state, and that reads. So one part where Professor Vinay Sitapati writes in half line is that when P.V. Narasimha Rao wrote to the state leadership saying, okay, you come up with some guy for the, you come up with a name as to what the party leadership and the state leadership should look like. They write back to him after extensive discussions that, is there someone specific in your mind that you want us to suggest? So, and I think that this, or what you write in terms of how she dealt with breaking up the syndicate, in that sense centralizing not just the government form but also the party, that is the Indian National Congress. So what happens is that even at the time, even up until Nehru or Shastri, you saw the Indian National Congress is still, you have your regional leaders who are largely running the show for the party. And in fact, there's some point, I think there's a mention where, Jawaharlal Nehru's economic stance, or his intention of, the socialist idea was challenged by some of the local leaders saying, listen, you can say whatever you want, but the party does not run without funds from industrial houses, etc. So you had this power gambit where, state leaders were powerful enough. And this serves as a good prequel to that she breaks that apart completely. And to a large extent, the Indian National Congress in the 1990s thereafter suffers that, in terms of, because there's no state leadership, there's no grassroots, as we often say, okay, it didn't remain what you would otherwise call a cadre party up until that point. So do you think on that sense that break comes from Mrs. Gandhi projecting her own will onto the party here, that that the party is somehow still not recovered after that, even 10 or about decades thereafter?
No, I mean, I think you're right in terms of what the consequences of it were. But I think the run up to it, we need to understand in a little bit more detail, right? So, see, the Congress Party, as it was constituted under Jawaharlal Nehru and particularly Sardar Patel, because he was the one who created the party structures, right, was premised on a very close relationship between the central executive of the party, which is, in parliament and in government, but the various states that the Congress controlled. And Congress controlled practically all the states up until that point of time, right? And so there were senior party leaders in each of those places. And because Indian politics operated in a way that it did through the 1950s, where the state level, regional sort of political bosses were the people who would effectively aggregate votes for the party by making various kinds of caste coalition, using the dominant castes in various kinds of ways to, get people to the polling booth to vote for the Congress and stuff. So there is an aggregation of pattern. That's what Rajni Kothari and others used to call the one-party dominant system. Right. Yes. The Congress Party was a federalist kind of structure within the party itself in some ways. Now, Indira Gandhi, you're right, makes a decisive break. I mean, the only sort of point I would like to say, and this goes against the grain of much of what political scientists have tend to write about, is that, there is a sense that Indira Gandhi took a perfectly well-functioning apparatus and then broke it up. Actually, that's not true. Even in Jawaharlal Nehru's own time, this apparatus was actually stopping to deliver results. 1967 is a very good example. It did not quite work in the way that it was supposed to work, and it was known even before that post-Nehru, many of the regional bosses were controlling even the central party apparatus in ways that were kind of questionable, right? I mean, what is the relationship between the party president, AICC, CWC, etc., and the government and such like things? So all of that comes to a fore. So in a sense, I do not believe that the old Congress party could have continued on course regardless in 1967. But the split was still a very momentous thing for exactly the reason that you say, which is that the split followed by the election victories, the Bangladesh war, etc., left her in a highly dominating sort of way. But it meant that the party's own internal structures could never be reconstituted in ways that could reflect the strengths of the party, right? Now, the role of the chief ministers is a very interesting one, because in 1972, when the party actually wins all the state elections, that majority of them, even including those which had lost in the 67 elections, the sense very much is that it is not the states which are now delivering the result, but it is Mrs. Gandhi who is delivering the results for the party, right? So everyone owes their standing to her.
Yeah.
Whether you are a member of parliament or you are in the state legislatures, right? And it's clear from accounts of elections and so on, even how election campaigns were being organized at that point in time. So it was all, the sense was that she is what is getting the party these massive wins, and that the party is therefore beholden. Which is why then, all your chief ministers, etc., are people who are effectively appointees of Mrs. Gandhi. Indira Gandhi kind of does that. And Andhra Pradesh is, of course, a particularly egregious case, which even in 1980, she does the same thing, which then culminates in the backlash against her and brings the Telugu Desam party under NTR into power. But, it's interesting you should mention P.V. Narasimha Rao, because Narasimha Rao was one such appointee of hers. He had no base in the Andhra Congress at that point of time, for him to become chief minister. And he became for a while, and then there was a backlash from down, and then he had to exit because things got too hot for him. But there were chief ministers who did manage to solidify their own basis. I think the most impressive, energetic, and perhaps accomplished of these chief ministers was the chief minister of Karnataka, a man called Devraj Ars, who emerged as not just a very powerful chief minister, but someone who created his own social base, even under the umbrella of Indira Gandhi, and even during the time of the emergency and so on. In fact, if you recall, when Indira Gandhi tries to come back to parliament, she loses the 1977 elections after emergency.
Yes.
But in 78, she fights a by-election. That by-election is from Karnataka. It's because she knows that Devraj Ars can give her a seat where she actually has a chance to come back, right? And so Devraj Ars, then actually when she splits the party again in 79, he is the leader of the breakaway faction because he falls out with Sanjay Gandhi, etc. So there were some chief ministers who were powerful. And again, I will say that, on at least on certain policy issues, when some huge blunders were being made, like in 1974, there is a decision to nationalize all of wheat trade. It is actually the chief ministers in the wheat producing states who push back and say that, listen, you are now aligning us against all the landed and trading interests in the state. And the Congress party is going to pay a very heavy price, right? So after about 6-7 months, she actually agrees to roll back some of those parties. So yes, you're right that, the older kind of structure never there. And at the top level, the idea is that, we'll try and give the youth Congress a chance to come back and, reconstitute, bring new talent, etc., etc. But that's a pipe dream. It never really works out. And invariably, she moves towards a more family sort of dynastic succession model. So Sanjay Gandhi is first the chosen heir. Then after his death, it's Rajiv Gandhi. And by the time Rajiv Gandhi's tenure runs out, the Congress party's entire kind of, structure itself is weakened out. And you can see that only getting weaker with time as time has passed, right? So you're right to say that it all, in some ways, began with her move to sort of break the party and then her inability to reconstitute the party. Those two things put together, I think, explains some of the origins of the current kind of challenges that the party faces.
So I think an interesting point that you mentioned, Professor, is with respect to the chief ministers or the party itself, posing certain economic agendas, right? And another interesting theme that I do pick, especially on the chapter where you begin with the emergency, is that Mrs. Gandhi's government always had a certain economic agenda, right? There was certain, obviously she wanted to continue the Nehruvian socialist legacy, etc. Right? There were people who were also pushing her further left in terms of her economic reforms. As you said, some oppositions coming from the states. But at the same time, the emergency worked as a as a tool or as a platform to further this agenda, which was not otherwise being. Uh, it was being implemented, but not in the manner that the emergency helped. For example, you mentioned the demolitions and the sort of beautification of Delhi, in that sense, right? Jagmohan, Sanjay Gandhi being behind it. So, one particular thing that I saw is that again, the economic agenda was difficult to implement, or let's say a socialist or a left wing economic agenda would have become more difficult to implement in what would have otherwise been a broadly democratic, including, push and pull coming from the party itself. I mean, sure, you had the Swaraj party, you had Swatantrata, and you had the Jansangh not as economic right as um,
Swatantra Party India.
Swatantrata party, and but at the same time there was some opposition coming in from the party itself, right? That is the Congress party itself. And do you think that so again there were these battles going on, but this ideological battle in terms of this economic agenda, the emergency was a necessity to take that forward, or without the emergency perhaps something like that, I mean, it would have continued for sure, but the execution, the implementation, because you also write that there are times where Mrs. Gandhi did not just rely upon the bureaucratic advisors, even in terms of the creation of the policy as well as the implementation of the policy, the party was brought in, right? So, but do you think that that emergency was a necessary, a wheel, or to put things in motion in terms of implementation of a certain economic agenda? And if you could also comment on, Mr. Hux's role, who served as advisor to her, he had a certain economic bent towards the left, and that is something that she shared with him as well, and that sort of pushed that agenda forward. Do you think the emergency was an important tool to take that forward?
Well,
Do you think it could have
I
happened
actually,
without it? Sorry.
yeah, so it's an interesting question because I think the emergency has got somewhat contradictory tendencies in terms of economic policies, right? So let's just go back to this moment of so-called socialist turn in Indira Gandhi's kind of economic policies. I think the moment again is very much 1969, which coincides with the breakup of the party. Because when she breaks the party, she is left as the leader of a minority government. And she wants to fashion this kind of a Caesarist popular appeal to people and so on. And that appeal is premised on the idea that, we are going to give a big push for not just development, but for social justice. Socialism is going to be on the agenda, etc. But that is also important because politically she is needs the help of the Communist Party of India, which is the sort of more, how do you put it, the right wing of all the CPs, so to speak, at that point of time, becomes an ally, right? So that is the period when there is a very sharp leftward turn in economic policy making. Particularly, you have bank nationalization, you do this privy purse abolition, which is kind of not got any consequence, but signals progressive credentials. Then you do the Monopolies and Restrictive Practices Act. You constitute that commission. You bring in the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, and so on, right? At this time, she also has, again, in terms of advisors, I think she was clever that she never kind of allowed herself to be pigeonholed by any one ideological coterie, right? So on the one hand, she brings in old associates like Mohan Kumar Mangalam, whom she knew from the 1930s in England, who was a member of the CP and a major advocate of nationalization of various things. He was the major sort of brain behind coal nationalization, for instance. She brings such people, but she also brings in people like P.N. Dhar, the economist, who comes as an economic advisor to the PMO, who's not necessarily a what do you say, that socialist in his inclinations. In fact, he's one of those people who's advising her that let's look at the consequences of some of this. Where are we going to fund out all of this stuff? So the heyday of this kind of move, I think, lasts up to Vish nationalization, which happens in 1974, right? So even before the emergency, I think because of the pressures of global inflation, which happened because of the oil crisis in the Middle East, right? In 1973, there's the Arab-Israeli war, which leads to a fourfold increase in oil prices, which then has huge impacts on global inflation, but particularly for the Indian economy. And inflation is at the highest of any stretch in the 20th century. So it is external pressures which really force her to then pare back from some of this kind of thing, right? So when you come to the emergency, therefore, the 20-point program, has all this kind of socialist language. But in practice, if you look at it, Mrs. Gandhi cracks down on all the trade unions, which is why much of the business community is reasonably happy with the emergency because they don't have that much labor trouble. Secondly, there is a very strong anti-inflationary bent to what is being done both before the emergency and during the emergency, including things like not giving DNS allowances, wage freezes, deferred payment of wages, various kinds of things, right? I mean, tough policies, stabilization, macroeconomic, somewhat conservative, you might say. But at the same time, the emergency has other kinds of things. They bring in some amendments to labor laws and stuff, which actually make it more difficult to fire workers from units. So it's a contradictory mix of things. Now, what is the relationship between the emergency and better known economic or measures which were related to economic policies, like say population control, family planning and stuff? There's a very coercive kind of drive which is launched. This whole slum clearance thing, which is particularly concentrated in Delhi, but doesn't have that much traction in other places. Now, see, the point is that all of these ideas were there even before the emergency. In fact, the family planning and population control thing is being discussed a decade before. Some of these kinds of, incentive-based, coercive, using various kinds of tools to get contraceptives and other kinds of, things done is already in place. But what the emergency allows the government to do is to really amp up the scale at which these things are being done. Precisely because during the emergency, the fundamental rights are suspended, including the right to move to the courts. So if you think of this being attempted in any normal time, you would assume that a bunch of people who are at the receiving end of it would approach the constitutional courts, and the courts would at least do something. But that remedy was no longer available to them, which is why the emergency becomes the time when these policies really get out of hand in some ways. Right? So it is in that sense that I think those two things are linked. But the emergency allowed her to kind of, as I said, project a more pro-business approach in some ways. She was seen as more favorable by people like Yadi Tata and stuff, right? I mean, many of the businessmen of the period thought that, especially on labor, the fact that some of the, tighter controls were being pared off, things which she herself had bought in or her policies had bought in, were sought to be eased up a little bit. So it had this contradictory kind of, tendencies within the emergency, partly because nobody had really thought that the emergency was being imposed for any economic platform. The 20-point program is only they came up with it the morning after imposing the emergency, right?
Yes. So, yes. And while she was your Caesarist figure, she was running the show, but an interesting theme that I do pick up, and you mentioned that extensively in all of the chapters, is that when you're dealing with a particular theme, you tell us extensively about a particular individual who might have been the driving force advising Mrs. Gandhi on that, right? And so my next question would be about the people around Mrs. Gandhi, and I'm reminded of the Dinkar reference on Samar Shesh. Obviously, these are people who are actively involved. These are not people who are tatast, or they're not on the sidelines, but there are also people on the sidelines, right? Business communities, people from the legal profession, the judiciary. That's another very interesting issue, which I will come to. But I want to deal with certain people, or I would like you to comment on certain people in their role largely, not just in the emergency, but also with Mrs. Gandhi. I think, obviously, there is B.K. Nehru, who's an important figure who, well, disagrees with her in few things, at a later stage decides not to disagree whatsoever. So what is the sort of role that he played in terms of influencing her, in terms of, guiding her, and who's been around for much longer, who she is seen earlier as, I mean, I wouldn't even call it an elder in that sense, but yeah, she looks up to him in some manner. So what has been his role in shaping her as the leader that she became? Or was he trying to curtail her to, not go down a particular extreme path? What is the role that he played there? And then we maybe discuss a couple of others.
Yeah, sure. So B.K. Nehru is a kind of an interesting figure, right? Because he is her father's cousin. So clearly someone she has pretty much known from the time she was a child. But B.K. Nehru is also interesting because, he's a maverick. In a sense, he has his own ideas. He's very outspoken, is never kind of shy, and has a fantastic sense of humor. So which means that most often, even when he's making points which are kind of not going down well, he has a way of kind of conveying it, which obviously, it's kind of works for him. So, for instance, he thinks that not just her economic policies, but her father's economic policies are all disastrous, right? And we get there. In fact, there is a part of a letter that he writes to her, which I have not cited in the book, but I can sort of tell you that, he says that one day in 1949, your father had come to the UN, and at that time he was posted to the World Bank. So he called me to New York, and I was in the hotel room where he was staying. And he explained to me all the plans, first 5-year plans, and what they are thinking about industrialization, etc. And I told him why I thought all of that was totally the wrong way to do things. And he said, that's the only time in your father's life where he actually used physical force against me. He punched me, and then he said, you're all talking nonsense. And then, of course, in his own way, then he got me a drink. And, so he had that kind of a relationship, right? So he, first of all, on economic policies, even before the emergency, he tells her that your policies are all wrong. In fact, he writes a letter to her saying, abandon the slogan of Garibi Hatao, make Utpadan Badhao your this thing. Focus on production, focus on growth. right? And then she asks, okay, tell me things. And then he actually says a few things which he actually does. Because as I said, already before the emergency, there's an attempt to understand that this is now landing us up in very hot water, so to speak. Now, during the emergency, he is High Commissioner in London, right? And he's actually a great supporter of the emergency. And this comes through not only in his letters to her, but in a very nice memoir which he wrote in, I think, in the late 1990s, where he says that, I was a major supporter of the emergency. He said, I spoke in favor of the emergency not just because I was a High Commissioner in London and had to speak, but because I thought this was what India needed. Because he felt that, this whole model of parliamentary democracy, which we had copied from Britain, is not working in the context of India. He had his own ideas about why it would not work and so on. And he, in fact, had very interesting ideas about the Indian constitution, because some of your, listeners may also be people who are in the law. When Granville Austin's second volume came out, Working the Indian Constitution, he was asked to sort of, chair a discussion on the book. And there is a very interesting letter in the Austin archives in Princeton, written by B.K. Nehru, where he says that, I feel your book is a bit like the Indian Constitution. It is so good that you should make a temple and worship it. I don't think it works in practice at all. So, so B.K. Nehru had all these very wild ideas about. But so during the emergency, he's the one who tells her that, listen, your Caesarism or whatever, he doesn't use the word, but the particular model which you're casting has to be now formalized. And the best way to do it is to make an executive presidency. So he brings the French Fifth Republic model and the de Gaulle kind of Gaullist structure. He says that, president has a lot of power. That is what you need. But at the same time, he's not someone who's for all-out authoritarianism. So he says that unlike the French, we should have one term of 7 years. You give 7 years to yourself, then you hand over power to someone else, right? And that actually has a lot of discussion, as I say in the book. It doesn't eventually end up there, but there is a lot of discussion. And some of those discussions also flow into the 42nd Amendment. We can talk about it later. But, again, in her last term in office, when she comes back, he is the governor in J&K, and Mrs. Gandhi is very intent on dismissing the government of Farooq Abdullah. And she puts a lot of pressure on him to say that, you have to just kind of dissolve the government, allow someone else to prove a majority. And he's resolutely resists. He says, the constitution doesn't allow me to operate in these ways. As governor, I cannot. He says that you please get someone else to do the work. I cannot do this, right? And in fact, but she won't let go of him either. So he's periodically called into Delhi. Her secretary, Principal P.C. Alexander, would tell him, saying that, listen, we have news that Farooq Abdullah has lost support of 30 MLAs. He just tells him, saying, I don't know what you guys are talking about, right? I mean, so he is very blunt and forthright. So again, one of those kind of maverick figures to whom she listened from time to time whenever it suited her.
Oh, very interesting that you say that, okay, I will not do this kind of work. You ask someone else to do it. And in contrast, there's this other figure, right? Huxer, right? Who at the same time is also independent-minded, who she says, all right, there are times where he will, say this is not correct. He'll express his opinion. But at the same time, he's, apart from the fact that they're, ideologically aligned on a lot of things, she's also known him for long. But at the same time, this is someone who goes the extra mile. Right? Who goes the extra mile for her, who not just through constitutional means, but even through going way beyond whatever is, the fragilities of ethics in the public domain. He crosses all of those boundaries for her, right? And this is someone who has been with her in the UK, and thereafter Jawaharlal Nehru picks him up, gets him into the services, and who then goes on to become one of her closest advisors, right? So what is the role that he played in that sense? In shaping her, in shaping what she wanted from him, and or just wanted done in the first place. So that I thought that another very interesting figure there.
No, again, I would say extremely interesting, contradictory sort of figure with various kinds of pulls to his personality. She was very important because she got him when he was Deputy High Commissioner in London to become her principal secretary. Right now, it was a somewhat odd choice because Huxer is an IFS officer. He has never dealt with the Indian administration in Delhi domestically, right? So, but she needed someone she could trust. And she knew that he was an intelligent man and that he knew how to sort of aggregate power on her behalf. And in the period of her sort of contestation within the Congress party, her decision to break the Congress party, bring in all of these kind of left-leaning policies, not just because of his ideological conviction, but also their political sort of salience, and the dealing of the 1971 Bangladesh crisis, he is absolutely central to everything that she does. And again, someone, who, if you look at the various kinds of minutes that he would write, could be quite cutting and forthright in telling her that, listen, this just doesn't work, or that this is a rot in the party. And, someone, but again, he was very blunt, outspoken with her. There are some letters where she refers to him as, Aksa Saab, or Babu Bhai, and, they had various sort of levels to their relationship, right? I mean, of familiarity and how he himself would conduct. So he was actually quite indispensable. And again, I would say a person who, in some ways, had certain traits of integrity which are worth underlining as well. So, for instance, already in 1971, he had picked P.N. Dhar to succeed him and wanted to leave the Prime Minister's Secretariat because he felt that he had done his work. That, you needed me to sort of aggregate all this power, consolidate your position. I have done it. Then the Bangladesh crisis happens. Then she asks him to stay on for a little longer, which he does. Then she sends him to deal with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in the post-war negotiations, sends him to Iran, various kinds of things. But by 73, he has fallen out to Sanjay Gandhi. And in fact, he tells B.K. Nehru at one point. He says that, listen, whatever happens, don't say anything against that boy because that is an absolute blind spot as far as she's concerned. Because at one point, B.K. Nehru wants to go and tell her during the emergency that your son is kind of all over the place, right? He says, I know you have a lot of brownie points with her, but don't try on that, right? Because he tried it and he kind of because he was very opposed to, or whatever, he cautioned her multiple times against the Maruti sort of licensing which happened and said that, this is not going to go down well at all. And she didn't like it. Sanjay Gandhi obviously didn't like it. And then he was. And again, during the emergency, one of his uncles was targeted and so on. And Jairam Ramesh, in his very good book on Haksar and Indira Gandhi, actually brings out all of these facts. But what is also interesting is that this is a person who leaves office in 73, right? At the time that he leaves office, he is told that we can give you a Padma Bhushan, we won't do that. He says, I don't want any government honors, right? But in 1975, he comes back as deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. But what I found very striking is Indira Gandhi's capacity to sort of inspire some very high degrees of loyalty among such people who had very important strands of integrity to their character, to the extent that they could do things which would vitiate all of that. So look at the two things that Haksar did just in 1975, in just that 1 year, which I think is so problematic, right? So when Indira Gandhi's case was coming up in the Allahabad High Court about her election, it was about an official in the PMO who was on the PMO roles but had already started working on a campaign. And Haksar actually went and perjured himself to the Allahabad High Court, saying that he had given a verbal instruction for that person to proceed on it, which is not true. There was no record, and he was. But even at that time, he had some qualms. For instance, he was against the destruction of the official record. So you have to still wonder what is going on, right? But he goes and perjures himself in the Allahabad High Court. And please remember that this was the High Court where he was practicing before Jawaharlal Nehru picked him up, as you said, right? So he was called to bar in that place. So it's his Karma Bhumi in some ways, right? He goes there and says this. And then subsequently, when the Prime Minister, after the emergency is imposed, after she brings in the first set of amendments which sort of try to fireproof her from any kind of judicial questioning of the Prime Minister's elections, etc., 30th Amendment, she tells him that you have to go and speak to each of the judges who are in the court and make sure, on this case, on the 5 judges, and make sure that they do not rule against me. And Haksar does it again. So suborning of the justices of the Supreme Court of India. Again, this is by a person who has held such high office and clearly had certain traits of integrity. So again, did it purely out of loyalty, even at a time when his own family is getting attacked, etc., right? Why? So you have to wonder and say that, she had some capacity to inspire loyalty amongst such people who are not obviously pushovers or people of no caliber or character, but clearly could set aside. Another person who I think is similar is a person who's perhaps not as well known as H.Y. Sharda Prasad, who was an information advisor. And again, someone who's known and, widely held, regarded, respected as a person of very high thing. Sharda Prasad expressed to many colleagues that his conscience was very troubled during the emergency, etc., etc. But again, as information advisor, when a proposal came up to do away with censorship or substitute it with some other kind of voluntary mechanisms on the part of the press, Khushwant Singh comes up with that idea, and P.N. Dhar is actually open to it. It is Sharda Prasad who shoots it up. So again, you have to wonder, right? Someone who says that my private conscience doesn't allow me to sleep well during the emergency. However, that is true in the night. In the morning, you are applying yourself very energetically on the files to advance the regime's aims. So I think that kind of loyalty that she was able to inspire among such people, I think was part of the reason that she succeeded so much in Indian politics.
That's true. Part of it is obviously got to do with the fact that she is that tall leader as well. And it's perhaps also, She is the prime minister. She's a powerful lady. So perhaps they're also looking at that proximity to power. But I think that part which you say, right, that gets me to other people who are otherwise very competent, have caliber. But those two institutions, one is obviously the media, and you make the reference to Kushwant Singh, right? And but the other one is the law officers, lawyers, as well as the judiciary, right? So there are two themes to this. One is obviously, as you said, it Rajan Ryan's case. Her case wouldn't start changing at that time. She starts off with the legal troubles, right? And you say he comes in, the Allahabad High Court says you're out. There are 2 weeks which allow you to, appeal to the Supreme Court. And then obviously Axel plays his role, which is obviously much later, right after the, as you say, the conditional stay. But not just this moment, even the emergency, Jabalpur, ADM Jabalpur's case, right? There, almost every high court that listens to it decides, all right, Article 21 is not going to be suspended, right? Comes to the Supreme Court, 4:1, you're like, no, nothing doing. We can suspend, the government can suspend this as well, right? Justice Khanna, as he says, I'm writing my death warrant when I'm writing this opinion, right? Obviously, he's remembered for at least that right thing. But at the same time, I see, and this theme was very prevalent because her party has come, party which is one, pillar to, keep a check. That's absolutely come under her wing, right? The parliament is, because the party is so large, because the party has all the control, as you say, right? Most of the legislations are passing because, well, they have control of the houses, both in the states, wherever the amendments so require, as well as obviously the central parliament. But at the same time, obviously the media is largely censored, but the judiciary, right? You do mention this specifically, that all of this is possible, and because today we see, we're in the summer vacations, and even when there's courts aren't sitting, or there's an emergency mentioning that's required, most often it's just going to be two things: either someone's going to be hanged till death, or there's a demolition happening. So that's courts today. Courts across the country tend to give that precedence over everything else. Early in the morning, someone makes a mentioning. Afternoon, they're going to listen to it. That very afternoon, get a stay on that demolition, right? And this is almost a daily prakriya where courts today are concerned. But we go back to that period, but courts themselves decide. Or the Supreme Court specifically, if we were to be extremely accurate, the Supreme Court decides back in the day that, listen, you don't have a right to come to court. You don't have a right because this is the point where Justice Khanna's opinion is also there, that this is not just liberty, it is life.
Yeah, exactly.
And you capture that in the book as well. So one theme, and I'd like you to comment on that, okay, she has a personal legal case, so that's a personal legal problem. But then she uses the legal apparatus. Parliament amends the constitution on one end, right? 39th Amendment. The portion I'm referring to is the part where there can be no challenge to the elections of the president, the vice president, prime minister, right? Now this is seen as retrospective. That okay, if there's something that's happened earlier, or like in the fact that her election and challenge everything was before this amendment. So that's another very interesting thing, that she uses the legal machinery completely. Her advisors are all right. So even when she goes to the president for the declaration of the emergency, right? Before, when she asks, okay, what can we do within the provisions? What can we do within the procedures that we have? She's told, all right, there is an internal emergency. Even that's not followed, right? So in that sense, there is a breaking of the law, right? And the declaration is illegal, all of that. But the role that the legal system played, right? The administrative, the bureaucratic system, we expect on some level, right? They're part of that political machinery. They're expected to carry out the policies. Right? But the whole role of the legal system, the judiciary specifically, was intended to be, or was supposed to be, was a listen, where there's a line that's crossed, you try to stop that from happening. But that doesn't happen at all. And judges thereafter, who are seen, they go on to say, and you mentioned that in the book, Justice Chandrachud and Bhagwati say that, oh no, what we were actually trying to protect was the judiciary, which is very similar to FDR back in the day when he threatens them to pack judges if the New Deal agenda is not. So they said, all right, we'll fall in line. But at the same time, don't you think that falling in line, both for the media and the legal system, was not just falling, and as we very often say, that you were asked to bend, started to crawl. So I think that's another very interesting area, that her personal legal problems lead to so many. So we say this very often, that bad facts make great law. There was bad facts that made very bad law in this particular case.
Yeah, yeah. So, see, the judiciary story is obviously it's something which has a bit of a background, right? I mean, it is not something that just happens overnight. That the emergency is declared and the Supreme Court of India decides that they will go ahead with all the kinds of things that the government, is claiming that the emergency allows them to do, including 21, etc. Right? I mean, see, the starting point really it actually begins almost at the beginning of her career as prime minister. And the starting point of the sort of let's put it this way, the friction between the judiciary and Mrs. Gandhi's government is really the 1967 Golaknath case, right? And again, I don't want to sort of get into the merits of those things, but um, what happens is that in the Golaknath case, basically the Supreme Court makes a claim that the Parliament's ability to, or the government of the day, through Parliament's their ability to kind of amend certain parts of the Constitution is not kind of upheld, right? And that is seen as an attack on the Parliament's ability to do things, particularly when it comes to directive principles and issues relating to that. Now, the Golaknath judgment is seen by the government as a very politically motivated judgment, right? And that is partly because of two things. One is the government, Mrs. Gandhi and others, know from even before the judgment is given that the judges are concerned that the executive is becoming kind of very powerful, and that they want to kind of make sure that there is no tendency towards undermining fundamental rights and such like things. So they want to make a strong point. But then there's something which happens soon after the judgment, which is that the Chief Justice of India, Justice Subbarao, who's on the bench, actually resigns his position as Chief Justice and becomes the opposition's candidate for the President of India's post.
Yeah.
Which, if you think, is an extraordinary political gesture of the time, right? And Mrs. Gandhi and her group see it as an outright this thing. They say that this man has given a political sort of verdict against us, and then he goes and does this kind of a thing, right? So the how do you put it, the contest with the judiciary therefore is not simply over fine points of constitutional law and what the executive should do, but is also seen as a power struggle in some ways.
Absolutely.
Which is what politics ultimately is about, right? It's about power, right? I mean, there is an element of politics and power which comes into the relationship between the executive and judiciary, which cannot be, I mean, at least from the perspective of the government of the day, it was not simply about the law or the finer points of the Constitution and so on. They felt that this was what it was, right? And then, of course, the judiciary successively sort of strikes down bank nationalization, privy purses. Then they have to find workarounds and various kinds of things are done, right? So if you look at the Mrs. Gandhi's decision in 1970, December 1970, when she advances the general elections by 1 full year and calls for an early election, her speech is worth looking at. Because what she says there is that the Supreme Court has prevented my government from doing things which are for the people. And I want to go to the people and get a mandate. Yeah, that is the only point she says in support of why she calls an election. So do remember that from her perspective, this has already acquired political overtones of a kind, which a purely constitutional law perspective cannot kind of, help us understand what is happening. So when the first cabinet meeting is held after the 1971 election is won by her party and the cabinet is formed, on the agenda is the next set of constitutional amendments that they want to sort of push through, right? And that all culminates in the Keshwanand Bharati case, after which she then decides to and actually goes ahead and supersedes the two senior most judges of the court and brings in the Justice A. N. Ray as Chief Justice. And that then sends a signal that the government wants to back, right? And again, it's not just some kind of a vague signal which is sent. Mohan Kumar Mangalam, who is a senior lawyer in his own way, he was Advocate General of the Tamil Nadu state, actually writes a pamphlet on the supersession of judges, which he publishes at that time. Think of it, the sitting kind of minister actually writes, and he says that why should the government not choose judges who are ideologically aligned with us in a sense of what we want to do? We want to adopt progressive policies. The Supreme Court is a highly conservative institution. Why should we sort of not have the prerogative to do this stuff, right? So it is a clearly political kind of a battle which is being played out, right? And once the emergency is bought in, the packing of the court has already happened. So in a sense, this is the opposite of the FDR story, right? I mean, you already packed the courts. And then the courts fall in line. Now, again, I think it's an important question to ask, which is what Justice Khanna in his sort of dissenting sort of thing when ADM Jabalpur says that, is it really the case that, we are only dependent on 21? Aren't there many other parts of the Constitution which give us so many other ways in which this court can exercise its kind of, role of judicial review and so on? But the fact is that the bench simply doesn't want to do any of that stuff. Yeah. And and there are other kinds of things, right? I mean, there are, like you mentioned about the high courts. See, the high courts also in our system are constitutional courts, right? So, but the high courts actually go ahead and strike down so many things relating to habeas corpus, press censorship, and all of that is kind of disregarded by the government. In fact, the verdict on the press censorship, two high courts, I think Bombay and Gujarat High Court, actually sort of say that this is ridiculous, pass some very strong strictures. But the government censors even the reporting on that particular verdict, right? So this is really now taking things to a level where you just know that the Supreme Court is finally going to sort of go along with what you want. So the high courts can go to hell. But in our system, high courts are constitutional courts. So you just see, and then she strikes back against the high court sort of judges by transferring about 50 of them to other states without their permission, right? When transfers happen, but transfers are supposed to happen with concurrence. But all of that is set aside. And Justice A.N. Ray, who's the Supreme Court Chief Justice, is just told that either you organize these transfers or you resign. That's it. So and the judiciary, for totally misguided reasons, falls in line with all of this. And then, of course, again, there is what happens thereafter is something we can discuss. But I think there is a general sense that the Supreme Court kind of, whatever, learned its lesson, started doing other kinds of more, public interest litigation, etc., comes out of the post-emergency. But I think, frankly, they never recovered as an institution seriously from what happened at that point of time. Because both during the Janata government, again, when she came back in 1980, again, she did a round of transfers of high court judges. So, all of which the judiciary had to go along. So, in a sense, the institutional sort of position of the judiciary was weakened in a way that made it then possible only for them to come back into the game through highly dubious moves like saying we'll have a collegium, we'll have other things which are all up for discussion and continue to be points of debate, right? So,
so I found that to be, again, a personal interest in that area. And I think one particular individual, I think Palkhiwala's role, someone who's otherwise been for all the private parties and the petitioners in challenging all of these legislations and amendments, who goes on to defend her. And in her case, where the appeal is filed against the Allahabad High Court decision, I found that to be very interesting. Otherwise, someone who's taken a vocal stance, senior economist, senior counsel, takes a stance against the government on almost everything there is. I mean, that's also the nature of how he's come about to be where he is. But at that moment, being a professional, he says, all right, you might have a case here, I'm going to defend you. They get that very skewed order. And I completely agree, because on some level I was thinking, as a student of law and as of history, is that perhaps the course of history would have been very, very different if that order was something else. It's the peculiarity of that order by Justice IYEA in the Supreme Court is something that I think to some extent contributes largely to how things came about in terms of the declaration of the emergency, how Mrs. Gandhi's regime came forward thereafter. So I think those two characters as well, I think played some role. I don't know if had there been someone else barring Mr. Palkhiwala, if that could have happened.
Historians talk of the Cleopatra's nose kind of theory of history, right? That if the length of the nose was shorter, maybe the course of history would have been different and so on. So I think a lot had happened already by that time. But let's go back to Palkhiwala. You're right. Palkhiwala, very interesting figure, appears against the government on practically all the cases, right? Bank nationalization, privy purses, everything. Keshwanand Bharti. I mean, but at the moment when the Allahabad High Court judgment and, when the High Court gives her enough time to appeal, then her law minister and Gokhale and others tell her that, Palkhiwala is the best person, so let's go to him, right? Again, strange choice. Because not only has Palkhiwala appeared against the government, but a few months before the emergence, all of this happened, in October to December 1974, Palkhiwala actually writes a short book where he says why the constitution is from danger if Indira Gandhi comes back for one more term. Yeah, so he's actually published a book saying that there is some serious threats to the way that this constitution is going to operate if we are going to continue with the current regime, etc., right? But at that moment, for reasons which I find genuinely unfathomable, I'm sure professional, legal sort of identity and obligations are an important thing. But, there were others who refused to serve her. Soli Sorabji being a notable example, who resigned his position in the government, right? So, but Palkhiwala said, yes, not only will he appear, but Palkhiwala not only said that he will appear on her behalf, he advised her not to resign. He said there is no need to resign. Secondly, he said we will get an unconditional stay from the Supreme Court. which again, Justice Iyer said that there is no precedent for such an unconditional stay. So Palkhiwala is not only kind of willing to appear, but gives her advice which fortifies her position, right? So again, all I can say is that, like a true liberal, I think Palkhiwala's conscience kind of, is liberal conscience is a tricky thing. Let's put it that way, right? I mean, so, so Palkhiwala actually appears, and so it's an interesting thing, right? Justice Krishna here again, interesting person, because Krishna Iyer and she have a long history, which is very interesting, because Krishna Iyer was the law minister in the first Kerala government under EMS Namboodiripal, which she was instrumental as Congress president in sort of getting dismissed, right? Of course, the dismissal was done by her father, who was prime minister, but the entire Congress agitation in this thing against the elected government, in a sense, the preview of what was happening to Congress party in the 70s, that trailer was launched by her. And Krishna Iyer was her this thing. But Krishna Iyer is brought first to the law commission and then elevated as a judge in this progressive phase of hers. Because Krishna Iyer is not a party person, he's not a member of CPI. In fact, he was brought in by EMS to kind of be the law minister at that time. So he first becomes a member of the law commission and then becomes a judge. And Krishna Iyer's own kind of, he gave multiple interviews, including one very interesting one, which your viewers can check out on YouTube, where he explains about this whole thing, right? I mean, so H.R. Gokhale, who's the law minister, actually says that I want to come and meet you. So Krishna then says, no, you can't come and meet me, but I will schedule this hearing tomorrow, right? And within the same day, he passes the order. Next day, the order is passed and so on. And it's a convoluted order, not only because there is the whole question of conditional stay, where he says that you can function as prime minister, but you cannot function as MP, you cannot vote in parliament. I mean, in our system, where prime minister, executive and legislature have a certain kind of fusion. I don't even know how that works, but anyway, he knows the law better than I do. So that was one thing. But there's another sort of observation which is there in the order, where he says that the particular article under the Representation Act under which her conviction happened, he says it's kind of draconian in some ways, and that the legislature should actually use the first opportunity more or less to take a look at it, right? So that also then opens up a Pandora's box. You say you don't want to comment on the merits of the case because the matter is going to be sort of decided by a bench of the Supreme Court. This is only about the state, but then you introduce a thing like this. So it's let me just say that, again, I think we cannot understand these purely as legal kind of things which were taken purely on the merits of the law. I think judges make decisions based on what they see as broader kind of sets of consideration. Perhaps Krishna Iyer felt that, unseating a prime minister on what seemed like an offense which was clearly falling out of the law, but still somewhat, trivial in the context of things which could happen, might then, lead to other kinds of issues, etc. But to come back to your question, no, I am not so sure that even if that particular gone against her, we would have got some other outcome. I think we would have still gotten something like the emergency, because everything needed to make such a thing happen was already in place.
So it's the powder keg. It's going to happen any which way. No, but why I say this is because, interestingly, so Ram Javaya Kapoor's case, where you say, okay, the relationship between the legislature and the executive is termed to be like a buckle and a belt. Right. And that goes back to our, the parliamentary democracy, the cabinet form of government.
Yep.
So I think the law is fairly clear in the sense that if you can no longer serve as a member of the House, you cannot serve in the executive. Obviously, there is the duration. 6 months is what's given. Right? So there are multiple cases down that path. Obviously, some of them come later. But that's why I stressed upon the peculiarity of the order. Obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. But Ajay, the other person who was also a lawyer, who again, perhaps in one of those Cleopatra Noses scenarios, could have, not given us the emergency, was the president, Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Again, Cambridge trained lawyer, right?
Yeah.
Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed, again, Advocate General of Assam. He's a very senior sort of minister. He knows all the stuff. His principal legal advisor tells him not to sign that order for the emergency because he says you need a written advice of the Council of Ministers, the cabinet.
Absolutely.
Which he claims on the advice of A.N. Ray can be set aside under some business rules which are totally dubious and spurious. In fact, false. There is no such business rules which exist. In fact, in one of the amendments, they say that transactional business rules should not be asked to be produced before any court in order to even cover that particular thing which was done, right? That is the extent. But he gets the correct legal advice. He is a trained lawyer, someone who knows the law, has every power to prevent this, but does not do it. And we have to ask ourselves why. Because I think by that time, all the checks and balances of the system had already eroded to such a degree that, that's why I feel that the Cleopatra's nose theory will not work here. Because you know, come what may, we would have gotten something once 12th June happened.
That's true. I think on that end, and again, where we're running short on time here, uh, but that one particular point, and I think the theme of our discussion in the book sort of culminates well into the two quotes that you produce as part of the epilogue. One is obviously Machiavelli saying that there's nothing more difficult in the world than to usher into a new order of things. The second one, which is equally, if not more apt, is Engels. He says ultimately all of these guys, if you look at individuals, so again, we might say, okay, the Supreme Court as an institution is X, Y, or Z. Ultimately, it was those particular judges. You also had an H.R. Khanna, where you had everyone else who was upholding all of this. Right? So ultimately, it was just individuals, that time, political actors. Obviously, there is a role that everyone plays in their own specific domains, but including Mrs. Gandhi, those around her, and those against her. Right? Because JP might be seen as this great figure everyone looked up to. But at the same time, he's not capable of political mobilization. As you write, that the party organization is not something that he could do. That's why he relied so extensively upon the Jansangh in the RSS. So I think that is also a strong theme. And I think as students of history and political science, that ultimately these are individuals in their own struggle for power, whatever part of the government they are in, whether the government or the executive, the judiciary, or even the media for that matter. I think there's a touch upon that as well. Khushwant Singh, otherwise seen as, a lot of people, okay, liberal writer, has written extensively on a lot of things, does not shy away from saying what he thinks is.
No, and he's a supporter of Sanjay Gandhi during the emergency and stuff. So
Exactly.
took what was, and till later in his life, he never saw. No, you're absolutely right. See, I'd say that, there are two things that we need to think about. One is that, as Marx famously said, people make history, individuals do make history, but they never make it in circumstances of their own choice. Those circumstances are there. You have to, therefore, for us to understand any of these decisions, we have to situate those individuals within the context in which those decisions were being made. That does not mean that the individual responsibility is to be denied. Actually, it is the other way around, right? I mean, because I think the individual responsibility becomes more. And again, I will say that some of the broader things that we need to think about are, what kind of a constitutional structure did we actually sort of create, right? I mean, because it created the opportunities for people to then move us towards a system which was diametrically opposed to what was envisaged in the original constitutional design, right? But there are things, right? I mean, again, I would say that people have contradictory impulses. So, for instance, even with the judiciary, one of the things that I really sort of thought was admirable was, when the Morarji Desai sort of government is there, the Janta government, there is a call to say that, people like Chandrachud and, Bhagwati, etc., should not be given terms to become Chief Justice because of their role in ADM Jabalpur. And in fact, no less a figure than Jayaprakash Narayan writes to the Law Minister, Shanti Bhushan, that, that these people should never have a chance. And in fact, there are even demands saying that others, Beg and all, should be sort of thrown out and stuff. But both Shanti Bhushan and Morarji Desai say that no, a damage done to an institution cannot be undone by doing more damage along the same lines, right? I mean, so I would say credit to them. Yeah. But at the same time, the same Morarji Desai, when your MISA, which is the Preventive Detention Act, and the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, the most reviled piece of statute during the emergency, when it is to be repealed, they actually want to bring in another Preventive Detention Act. Because Morarji Desai knows what a Preventive Detention Act can do for you, right? So those are structures, and he writes, he said preventive detention is given in the Constitution itself. It's true. Yeah. So all I'm trying to say, therefore, is that, even as we look at individuals and so on, let's also look at what are the structures which enabled certain things to happen. And I think we perhaps tend to have a very, how do you put it, a somewhat kind of roseate picture of what was that structure to begin with. That is a thing for another day's discussion, perhaps. But I think we need to, if we are looking back at the emergency, I think just focusing on that period alone is not enough. We need to understand how a system which was designed to work in a very different way actually ended up like this in such a short period of time, right? I mean, and you could actually do it and carry out all of these things, right? So that, I think, means that we have to pay as much attention to the broader structures as the individuals who are there, and also understand that human beings are very contradictory in their impulses. So,
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I think the great men, or a great woman.
Or a great woman also. Like, whichever way you think about it. Right? I mean, that theory is, has got its limitations either way. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Professor Raghavan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for taking our time and joining us for this podcast. And it's an absolutely brilliant book. For those who are students of history, law, political science, or otherwise, or even those who enjoy a good thriller. I'm saying this once again, not only because I have interest in the field, but because it reads that way. We have some very interesting questions coming in about Maruti, Udyog, etc. But we are short on time. Professor Raghavan's got a flight to catch. So, but yes, the question is about the initiation of Maruti Udyog. It's the first point is to maybe pick up the book, so we'll get some answers there. But thank you so much, sir. And it's about 7.5, maybe 8 odd years since we had you on the podcast. And this was, I think, October 2017 when we had you last. We were discussing India, China back in the day, the Doklam incident. And this is something that we were quite looking forward to. And thank you so much for sparing your valuable time. It's been an absolute pleasure, sir.
No, thank you, Ajay. As always, it's great to be in this conversation. I know we have these constant exchanges about various things, but this is a nice opportunity and an important day on which to reflect on some of these things. So thanks for the opportunity, and good luck to all of you and the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye bye.